Paul Shehui took a photo of his wife, Loretta Lai, in front of her old Lamborghini at a reception at a Lamborghini dealership in Vancouver last year. Ruth Fremsonth, New York Times, Vancouver, British Columbia. In the tightly knit world of Vancouver's wealthy Chinese immigrants, Paul Shehui stood out for his ties to some of Canada's most powerful politicians and his mastery of cultivating guanxi, or personal relationships, that attracted legions of Chinese clients eager for his assistance in gaining a legal foothold in Canada. But behind closed doors, the authorities say, Mr. Yi, a prominent immigration consultant and philanthropist, ran an elaborate fraud scheme, pocketing nearly $6 million from investors, including many Chinese citizens led to believe their investment would help them secure permanent residency in Canada. Instead, the authorities say, he spent the money on luxury cars, beauty pageants and donations to the British Columbia Liberal Party. Everything he said were lies, said Chen Wei, a Chinese immigrant who testified earlier this year in a case against Mr. Yi before a British Columbia Securities Commission panel. Mr. Chen's family invested $1 million $782,000 in Mr. Oyi's project, according to hearing transcripts. The case is part of a pattern, experts say, of problems with Canada's immigration programs, which, like the United States, sets aside coveted residency permits for foreign investors. Some also say it underscores a troubling flaw in the Canadian justice system, which often allows white-collar criminals to walk away with little more than a slap on the wrist. Mr. Yi has denied the accusations, but even if he is found to have committed fraud, he will face financial penalties only, not jail time. Canada doesn't take financial crime seriously, said Christine Duheim, a lawyer in Vancouver who specializes in laws dealing with terrorist financing and money laundering. Mr. Yi, who immigrated to Canada in the 1980s, declined interview requests through his lawyer. The case against Mr. Yi was brought by the Commission, an independent provincial regulatory agency. The panel, appointed by the government, is expected to rule on the case this month. Apart from the financial penalties, Mr. Yi faces a possible ban from working in the securities industry. In Vancouver, Mr. Yi owned an immigration consulting and financial services company, and sought to use his connections in the Chinese community to raise money for a recycling startup, Cascade. But the Commission says that from 2009 to 2013, Mr. Yi told investors that the project was approved by the British Columbia government. It was not, and that their investments would give Chinese citizens the right to immigrate to Canada, as well as shower them with profits. All they had to do was transfer funds into the trust account of a local lawyer and member of the Canadian Parliament, Joe Pesci-Solido. This made investors feel safe, and that their money would be safe. Mila Pivnenko, one of the Commission lawyers, told the panel. Of course, Yi was the only person who directed the lawyer where to disburse the funds from the trust account. The Commission said Mr. Yi secretly transferred millions of dollars meant for the recycling company into his own bank accounts and issued shares in companies with no assets to investors in order to avoid detection. Mr. Yi raised about $13.3 million $10.5 million from 64 investors, but the Commission says he kept $6.9 million for himself. When Cascade went bankrupt in 2013, Mr. Yi told many investors they could recoup their money if they topped up their investment, without alerting them that he had never sent more than half the funds he had already raised from investors to the project, the Commission said. Jiang Yicheng, 53, a businessman from China's coastal Zhejiang province, said in a phone interview that during several visits to Vancouver, Mr. Yi chauffeured him and other Chinese investors around in a BMW, hosted lavish meals and showed off photos of himself posing with Canadian elected officials. Mr. Jiang was sold. He formed a consortium of Chinese investors who transferred more than $3 million for the recycling company, convinced by Mr. Oyi's promises that the project was backed by the government and would allow him to immigrate. Mr. Yi took advantage of our trust to cheat us, said Mr. Jiang, who has also filed a lawsuit in British Columbia against Mr. Yi. Mr. Jiang said he himself was successfully sued by the members of his consortium to recover the losses, which has left him penniless. Mr. Jiang said an associate wired payments from Hong Kong to Vancouver while Mr. Jiang transferred the equivalent in renminbi to the associate's bank account in mainland China, a form of underground banking that experts say is widely used to evade China's capital controls by wealthy Chinese to illicitly funnel money overseas. In an interview at a reception last year at a Vancouver Lamborghini dealership packed with Chinese-Canadian socialites, Mr. Yi bragged about his luxury cars and explained why many wealthy Chinese find Canada so attractive. They want a safe place to put their money, he said, reclining in the driver's seat of his black Bentley Mulsanne. Experts say the case against Mr. Yi fits a pattern of malfeasance that has tarnished Canada's immigration programs. In 2014, the Canadian government cancelled a federal immigrant investor program popular with Chinese millionaires after finding little economic benefit and frequent abuse. But provinces and territories have their own investor visa programs. Critics say many are rife with abuse and fraud. In April, 3 Chinese-Canadian immigration consultants were jailed for 18 months after they pleaded guilty to helping more than 1,600 immigrants, many from China, fraudulently maintain Canadian permanent residency and obtain citizenship. Bill Boyd, a Saskatchewan legislator, resigned in August after he was found to have violated conflict of interest laws for telling Chinese investors at a seminar in Beijing that they could obtain Canadian permanent residency by investing in a company he led. Advertisements for the seminar featured the official Saskatchewan government logo and falsely claimed that Mr. Boyd was the provincial economy minister. Richard Kurland, a former national chairman of the Canadian Bar Association's Citizenship and Immigration section, said lax oversight from the Canadian government and a preference for funding law enforcement departments that investigate violent crime and terrorism rather than white-collar crime added to the difficulties in policing the immigration programs. White-collar crime is tolerated because it's not a priority, he said. In 2016, a United States State Department report labeled Canada a major money laundering country. A review last year by the Financial Action Task Force, a global body that sets standards for combating money laundering, found that Canadian law enforcement agencies generally suffer from insufficient resources and expertise to pursue complicated cases, and that criminal penalties are not sufficiently dissuasive. In an email, Canada's Ministry of Finance said the task force's concerns will be reviewed by a parliamentary committee. Since its incorporation in 1995, the British Columbia Commission says it has collected less than 5% of assessed sanctions in their cases. Of the total $374 million outstanding, only about $78,000 is probably collectible, the Commission has said. In the meantime, those who say they were defrauded by Mr. Yi have seen their lives turned upside down. In his testimony, Yang Baoshi, a Chinese immigrant in Vancouver, said his wife made 2 suicide attempts after they lost $1.3 million to Mr. Yi's project. In the last few years, he said, I have been living in nightmare. Christopher Buckley and Adam Wu contributed research from Beijing.